Agatha Raisin and the Stranger Who Stayed. Too long, dear listeners. Welcome to tonight's mystery. I'm Jane, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to get to know you a little better. What's one hobby or passion that brings you joy? Are you into baking, painting, gardening, or perhaps something completely unexpected? Drop your answer in the comments. I always enjoy learning more about our wonderful community. And do not forget to like and subscribe. It will motivate me for more mysteries every day. Now, let's get cozy and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Quiet Cottage. Stirring. The morning sun spilled lazily through the lace curtains of Agatha Raisin's kitchen, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak table. She hummed a tuneless little song as she poured water into the kettle, the rhythmic hiss of the stove and the faint smell of freshly baked scones creating a bubble of quiet contentment. Outside, the garden gleamed with dew, the roses leaning under the weight of tiny droplets, and the soft chirping of birds harmonized with the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Agatha sipped her tea and sighed, relishing the rare luxury of an uninterrupted morning, when suddenly a knock at the door sliced through the tranquility. Startled, she set her cup down with exaggerated precision. Visitors were a rarity, unexpected ones rarer still. Peering through the small glass pane, she spotted a man she didn't recognize, neatly dressed, though his coat looked slightly too heavy for the mild morning, and his hat tilted at a peculiar angle. He waved a practiced gesture that struck her as slightly off. Agatha hesitated, adjusting her apron as if that alone could confer authority, and opened the door. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth, but carrying a faint accent she couldn't quite place. "I'm terribly sorry to intrude. Might I trouble you for directions to the village square?" He smiled politely, revealing a faintly crooked tooth, and tipped his hat with an exaggerated flourish. Agatha raised an eyebrow. "You mean the village centre? You're standing only a few minutes from it." Her tone was friendly but laced with curiosity. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the routine, orderly life of Carsely. "Oh, I do apologize," he said, glancing around as if noticing the garden for the first time. "It's my first visit. I've a tendency to wander and lose track." He gestured vaguely toward a small satchel slung over his shoulder, worn at the edges. "Quite new to these parts, you see." Agatha stepped back, nodding as she sized him up. There was a meticulousness in the way he adjusted his cuffs, a nervous flutter in his fingers that contrasted with the serene confidence he tried to project. She wondered if he was simply nervous, or if he had other reasons for such careful gestures. Her mind ticked over possibilities while she politely invited him in, motioning toward the kettle. "Would you care for a cup of tea while you collect yourself? It's hardly polite to wander about first thing in the morning, especially for newcomers." The man's smile widened, tinged with genuine relief. "That's extraordinarily kind. Tea would be delightful." As Agatha bustled about, pouring hot water into the teapot and selecting a plate of buttery scones, she couldn't resist a silent assessment. His coat was impeccable, yet somehow out of place. His eyes, a shade too bright, flicked over the cottage as though memorizing details. He didn't glance at the cat, the kettle, or the small stack of letters on the sideboard. Yet he noted the pattern on the curtains and the careful arrangement of herbs on the windowsill. Agatha placed the tray before him and studied his reaction. He picked up the scone delicately, inspected it as though it might contain a secret, and then smiled. "Marvelous," he said. "One can tell a lot about a village from its baked goods." Agatha allowed herself a small, private smile. There was humor here, absurd and subtle, and yet a thread of something else, an almost imperceptible tension that raised her curiosity like a delicate, teasing melody. She poured her own cup, sitting opposite him, and noted the way his gaze seemed to measure the room, the furniture, and her in equal parts. The quiet morning had been disrupted, yes, but in the most peculiar and interesting way. And somewhere beneath the polite conversation and steaming tea, Agatha sensed the first whisper of a mystery. Agatha polished the edge of her teacup, pretending to be occupied while keeping one eye on the stranger. He had settled comfortably into the chair, as if he had always belonged in her kitchen. There was an odd ease in the way he leaned back, yet his fingers drummed lightly on the table, betraying a restlessness that didn't quite match his calm expression. He spoke again, and Agatha leaned forward slightly, curious despite herself. "Your neighbours are quite remarkable," he said, eyes flicking toward the window, as though imagining them in their cottages. "The woman at the bakery, her scones are divine, but I hear she has a penchant for rearranging her herb garden every other day. And the vicar, fascinating man, though his sermons seem rather predictable. Agatha nearly choked on her tea. How could he possibly know such trivial details? A mixture of flattery and suspicion prickled at her. "I suppose people do talk," she said carefully, choosing words that hinted both at amusement and mild wariness. He smiled just faintly and continued, "Oh, certainly. But it's delightful to see someone like you keeping track of your little corner of the world. Not everyone notices the roses by the stone wall or the cat sleeping in a sunbeam." He paused, lifting his teacup as if to inspect it, though he did not sip. "It speaks volumes about the character of a place and of the people who live there." Agatha tilted her head, studying him. There was charm in his observation, no doubt, but also an unusual precision, as though he had walked the village in secret, noting each tiny idiosyncrasy. The longer he lingered, the more she felt the tug of curiosity pulling at her. "You seem very well informed," she said, a playful note in her voice. "Do you wander through the village often?" "Oh, occasionally," he replied, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I enjoy getting a sense of places, observing. One never knows what small details might reveal." He tapped the rim of his cup thoughtfully. "A little observation can uncover more than a casual glance." Agatha pursed her lips. There was something faintly rehearsed in his tone, yet she couldn't deny the allure of his insights. Should she ask more, or leave it at polite conversation? She considered the social rules she usually relied upon. Inviting guests for tea was courteous, almost obligatory, but her instincts whispered caution. Yet the cosy comfort of her kitchen, the warmth of the teacups, and the faint aroma of freshly baked scones invited a small gamble. "Very well," she said after a moment, motioning toward the kettle. "Perhaps you'd like another cup. I have more tea, and there are extra scones. It's not every day one meets one so." Attentive to village life, his eyes brightened, but only slightly, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Miss Ray." "That would be most agreeable." As Agatha refilled the teapot, she allowed herself a private smile. There was an odd rhythm to the conversation, a careful dance of words and subtle hints. Every so often he mentioned someone she knew or something that had happened in the village, yet the details were slightly askew, never quite aligning with memory. It was like a puzzle she was meant to notice, a breadcrumb trail placed just beyond easy reach. She placed the steaming cup before him and observed as he accepted it with gentle grace, his fingers brushing the handle with deliberate care. The room seemed warmer somehow, the clink of china and faint hiss of the kettle blending into a cozy, almost hypnotic backdrop. Yet underneath the comfort lay the whisper of tension. A stranger, charming and polite, yet undeniably curious about everything she valued. Agatha settled into her own chair, tea in hand, eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a smile tugging at her lips. The morning had started peacefully, but now it carried a subtle edge of anticipation. For while the stranger's presence, Chapter 2, Village Whispers, Agatha stepped out into the crisp morning air, the sun warming her shoulders as she made her way along the winding stone lane toward the village square. The path was familiar, lined with cottages boasting climbing roses and neatly tended window boxes. Birds flitted about the eaves, and the faint scent of baking bread drifted from Mrs. Dunning's bakery, promising treats worth a detour. Yet Agatha's mind was half on the gentle rumours she had already overheard, and half on the stranger who had lingered so long in her kitchen. As she reached the square, she found it already stirring with activity. Mr. Pritchard, the postman, was mid-lecture to a small audience of gossip-hungry villagers about a missing chicken that had caused a minor commotion Near the market lane, Mrs. Maple, sweeping the steps of her haberdashery, called out warnings about the weather turning chilly, though the sky was perfectly clear. Agatha smiled at the familiar chaos. Carsely had the comforting rhythm of small-town life, predictable in its absurdities, and yet full of surprises if one paid attention. She paused by the fountain, where a group of elderly women clustered in a circle, muttering conspiratorially. "Did you hear about the stranger?" one whispered, her spectacles slipping down her nose. "Came in yesterday, polite as you like, but he asked so many questions." "I'm sure he's up to something." Agatha allowed herself a suppressed smile, hiding behind the handle of her basket. She knew exactly whom they meant. Their voices carried just enough to pique curiosity without being loud, and she caught snippets, mentions of her neighbours' routines, odd observations, and speculation about the newcomer's intentions. "Stranger's too neat," another voice chimed in. "Keeps glancing at the flowers like he's cataloguing them. That's no ordinary visitor, I tell you." Agatha inwardly chuckled. She could picture him now, notebook in hand, pretending to admire the roses while memorizing every detail. She shook her head, pretending to fuss with a loose cobblestone, though her mind catalogued every comment with the precision of an experienced detective. Across the square, the baker, Mrs. Dunning, waved a flower-covered hand. "Morning, Miss Raisin. Have you met the gentleman yet?" He seemed peculiar. "I mean polite, of course, but something about almost like he's from another world." "Another world, indeed," Agatha murmured under her breath, amused. She observed the villagers' animated gestures and exaggerated expressions, the way small scandals became epic sagas with each retelling. Yet beneath the humour, there were threads of truth, curiosity, caution, and the unmistakable sense that someone was stirring the calm waters of Carsely as she wandered past the fountain. Agatha noticed subtle reactions from familiar faces, nods, widened eyes, half-smiles, and raised brows directed at her. She felt the delicate tension of attention, the unspoken question of whether she was involved in, or simply observing, the stranger's story. Her mind ticked over the facts she had already gathered, his polite demeanour, his curious questions, and the peculiar way he had absorbed every detail of her cottage and garden. She lingered briefly at the edge of the square, noting the interplay of personalities. There was humour in the gossip, certainly, but also information, small, easily overlooked, yet potentially revealing. Her pulse quickened with the gentle thrill of piecing together clues, even if only social ones. By the time she resumed her walk toward the bakery, Agatha had made several mental notes, the villagers' reactions, the snippets of rumour, and the subtle cues that might indicate whether the stranger was harmlessly curious or hiding something more. It was all very amusing, she thought, and a little exhilarating. Carsely, with its cobblestone charm and eccentric residents, offered the perfect stage for a quietly unfolding mystery. Agatha smiled to herself. The morning had begun with an ordinary routine, but the square had reminded her that in a village like this, even the smallest visitor could ripple through daily life, stirring questions, curiosity, and the promise of adventure, and she naturally intended to observe every ripple with great interest. Agatha returned home that afternoon, the soft crunch of gravel under her shoes providing a familiar rhythm as she approached her cottage. The morning had been lively in the village square, filled with gossip, laughter, and just enough intrigue to keep her curiosity humming. Yet, as she stepped over the threshold, a subtle unease tickled at the edges of her mind. Something was slightly off. She paused near the garden gate, her eyes scanning the neatly arranged bed. A small terracotta pot, usually tucked precisely beside the rose bush, had shifted a few inches toward the path. Agatha frowned, crouching to inspect it. The soil beneath was freshly disturbed, though no rain had fallen, and the pattern of the disturbance seemed deliberate rather than random. Her mind raced, cataloguing possibilities. A wayward animal, a clumsy neighbour, or the stranger. Her fingers hovered over the pot, brushing away the loose dirt, when a fleeting shadow at the corner of her vision made her glance toward the hedge. No one was there. Yet the sense of being observed lingered, a faint, almost teasing pressure at the back of her mind. She straightened, hands on her hips, and allowed herself a quiet sigh. Of course, she thought wryly, even in a sleepy village like Carsely, one could never entirely trust a stranger. Inside the kitchen, she noticed another oddity. The small basket of letters she had left on the sideboard had been nudged slightly toward the edge. Agatha's eyes narrowed. Nothing was missing, but the displacement was precise enough to suggest a careful hand rather than accidental movement. She tapped her chin, silently reviewing her interactions with the visitor, his polite inquiries, the oddly detailed knowledge of her neighbors, the way he had measured her kitchen with almost imperceptible glances. A smile tugged at her lips, half amusement and half exasperation. He was clever, she admitted, though not in a menacing way, yet. More like a cat playing with a mouse, testing boundaries without revealing intentions. Agatha poured herself a cup of tea and leaned by the window, gazing out at the garden as though expecting him to materialize among the roses. The sunlight caught the dew on the leaves, sparkling like tiny secrets scattered across green velvet. She picked up her knitting, fingers moving automatically through the familiar stitches, while her mind analyzed the subtle evidence. A footprint in the soft earth by the garden path, barely discernible, suggested someone had walked there recently. Its size did not match any of the villagers she could think of, and the angle indicated a careful observation rather than casual wandering. Her pulse quickened with the mild thrill of discovery, the kind that made mysteries so deliciously engaging. Agatha set the knitting aside and stepped onto the porch for a closer look. She bent down, tracing the edge of the footprint with a gloved finger, imagining the visitor sneaking quietly through the garden, curious about her routines. A shiver of amusement passed through her. He was bold, she realized, and perhaps more playful than dangerous, but the uncertainty kept her senses sharp. She glanced toward the gate again, half expecting to see him retreating into the distance. Nothing moved. Still, Agatha could not shake the impression that someone had been there, leaving traces that invited observation without confrontation. A misplaced pot, a nudged basket, a fleeting shadow small, subtle hints that made the mind wander deliciously into possibilities. Settling back in her chair, tea in hand, Agatha allowed herself a quiet chuckle. The stranger was no ordinary visitor, and she was beginning to enjoy the game he seemed to have started, even if she had no idea of the rules. Cozy though her cottage was, and calm though the afternoon appeared, the tension hummed softly beneath the surface, promising intrigue and amusement in equal measure. Agatha sipped her tea and leaned back, eyes flicking toward the garden one last time, certain of only one thing: she would be watching, and she would notice everything. Chapter 3. Tea and Tensions. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the kitchen window, falling in warm, golden strips across the worn oak table. Agatha arranged the cups with deliberate care, the faint clink of porcelain against saucers punctuating the soft hum of the kettle. Steam rose in gentle spirals, carrying the comforting aroma of freshly brewed tea and the buttery scent of scones still warm from the oven. Outside, a breeze stirred the roses, brushing the petals against the window-pane, and Agatha felt the familiar calm settle over her, until she glanced at the stranger seated across from her. He sipped his tea politely, eyes flicking occasionally to the lace curtains, the patterned carpet, and the neat arrangement of herbs on the window-sill. Agatha studied him over the rim of her own cup, noting the small details, the twitch of a finger, the faint lift of an eyebrow, the way he paused ever so slightly before replying. She had invited him for tea under the guise of hospitality, yet her true intent was far more deliberate. "So," she began casually, stirring her cup, "how do you find Carsely so far? Have you seen much of the village yet?" He smiled carefully, measured, as though weighing each word before it left his mouth. "It is quaint," he said. "Charming, in a rather understated way. One notices the little things, the routines, the gardens, the way people move through their day. Fascinating, really." Agatha tilted her head. "Fascinating, you say?" That's an unusual choice of word for a village filled with bakers, postmen, and gossipy neighbours. She allowed a soft chuckle to escape, watching him carefully. His expression remained neutral, but the faintest glimmer of amusement touched his eyes. He nodded slightly. "I suppose so. Perhaps I am easily amused. Or perhaps I pay more attention than most." Agatha's lips twitched. He was deflecting, yes, but the nuance of his phrasing, "I pay more attention," was suggestive, almost as if he were hinting at knowledge he was not fully ready to share. She pressed on lightly. "And these little observations, do they come naturally, or have you practiced this sort of thing before?" His pause was deliberate, a moment that seemed both polite and calculated. "One notices patterns in life," he said finally, "when one is inclined to do so. It is merely a habit of mine, I suppose. Observation, you could call it." Agatha nodded slowly, noting the subtle contradictions in his account. Earlier, he had spoken of wandering without intention. Now he described observation as habitual. She did not confront him directly, but allowed the tension to linger, enjoying the delicate game of inference and subtle challenge. The conversation flowed on, light on the surface but layered beneath with questions and half-revealed truths. He mentioned neighbours, but occasionally misremembered a detail, Mrs. Dunning's cat, for instance, being slightly older than he claimed. Agatha made a mental note, storing each inconsistency alongside his measured gestures and carefully chosen words. Steam rose from their cups, carrying the scent of Earl Grey and lemon. Agatha broke off a piece of scone, letting the warmth and buttery richness ground her amidst the tension. The act of eating, of sipping tea, seemed to anchor the conversation. In domestic comfort, even a subtle suspicion hummed beneath the surface. By the time the second cup of tea was poured, Agatha had observed enough to feel both intrigued and mildly amused. The stranger's manner was polite, his stories plausible, yet peppered with gentle contradictions. The rhythm of the tea, the quiet, clicks of cups, and the sunlight spilling across the table created a cosy backdrop for what was, in essence, a quiet duel of wits. Agatha leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing with playful calculation. The afternoon was warm, fragrant, and utterly ordinary in appearance, yet she could sense the delicate threads of intrigue weaving between them. The visitor was courteous, perhaps charming even, but beneath the politeness lay something she could not yet name, and she intended to find out. The late afternoon sun bathed Carsely in a warm, amber glow as Agatha strolled back through the village square. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual chatter of neighbours and clatter of carts replaced by a faint hush that set her mind buzzing with curiosity. Her eyes darted from one familiar cottage to another, noting the subtle signs that something had shifted in her usually predictable village. Near the fountain, she noticed an iron gate, normally propped open, now firmly locked with a heavy chain. Agatha frowned, stepping closer to inspect it. A few villagers lingered nearby, whispering in low tones, glancing nervously toward the square. Their expressions hinted at something more serious than mere concern over a misplaced chicken or a late delivery. "Did you hear about the old scandal at the manor?" one woman murmured to another, her voice barely audible but sharp enough to reach Agatha's ears. "They say someone saw the visitor near the grounds yesterday, just after, well, you know." Agatha paused, adjusting her scarf, as the pieces of information swirled in her mind. A connection, perhaps, between this new stranger and the village's past intrigue. Her curiosity piqued. She observed the hurried movements of Mr. Pritchard, the postman, who carried a bundle of letters with unusual haste. Even the baker, Mrs. Dunning, seemed distracted, stacking bread with exaggerated care, glancing over her shoulder more than necessary. A subtle sense of tension threaded through the scene, delicate enough not to alarm, yet enough to intrigue. Agatha's gaze sharpened, her mind catalogued each detail, the locked gate, the whispered conversations, the villagers' nervous glances, and the occasional pause of a passing figure, as though listening for something. she began to see patterns, forming almost imperceptible, yet insistent. Someone had entered Carsely and was quietly disturbing its rhythms. Her eyes wandered to the edges of the square, where a small shadow flickered near the alley by the cobbler's shop. A fleeting movement, too quick to identify clearly, vanished behind the corner. Agatha's heart gave a subtle lift of excitement. She had noticed it, yet no one else seemed to pay attention. Another clue, perhaps, in the quiet puzzle she was beginning to assemble. A few steps later, she spotted the stranger across the street, speaking politely with a villager. He laughed at something that seemed mundane, yet the way he tilted his head, scanning the square, suggested a deliberate awareness. Agatha tucked her hands into her coat pockets, letting her gaze linger just long enough to feel the subtle pull of intrigue. His presence seemed to thread through the village incidents like an invisible stitch, binding everyday occurrences with something more deliberate. She adjusted her pace, moving past the fountain and toward her garden path, her mind working through the connections. Locked gates, hushed whispers, a fleeting shadow, and now the stranger. Small, almost delicate hints that suggested observation, perhaps even calculation. Agatha's fingers tapped lightly against the edge of her basket, a habit when she was deep in thought. By the time she reached her own gate, she had constructed a tentative outline in her mind, a subtle narrative connecting the stranger to the village's quiet disturbances. There was no overt threat, no immediate danger, but the suspense was palpable in its understated way. Carsely's familiar charm, she reflected, only made the mystery more compelling. She smiled softly to herself, appreciating the cozy balance between village life and hidden secrets. The streets remained warm and inviting, the scent of baking bread and flowering hedges soothing her senses, even as her curiosity grew sharper. Agatha stepped into her garden, quietly resolved that she would continue to observe, question, and connect the threads, savoring the gentle suspense that now hummed through the afternoon. The village had its secrets, and she naturally would uncover them, one subtle clue at a time. Chapter 4. Shadows at Dusk. Twilight settled over Carsely like a soft blanket, dimming the cottages and painting long shadows across the garden paths. Agatha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch, the scent of damp earth and fading roses drifting toward her. The day's warmth had ebbed, leaving the air cool and still, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant clatter of a shutter closing. Her eyes scanned the garden with the careful attention of someone who had learned to notice subtle shifts in familiar spaces. A shadow moved near the hedge at the far end of the lawn. Agatha froze, heart skipping a beat, though her instincts urged caution and panic. She blinked, and the shadow vanished as though it had never been. Yet her mind replayed the movement, analyzing its shape and timing. No cat, no neighbor. This was something different. A faint thrill of curiosity stirred alongside the unease. Inside, she noticed her knitting basket had been nudged slightly closer to the hearth. Nothing was missing, yet the subtle rearrangement pricked at her sense of order. Her gaze drifted to the windowsill where the small collection of herbs remained untouched, yet she could not shake the feeling that they had been observed, catalogued, perhaps even studied. Agatha's lips curved into a small, wry smile. Whoever it was, they had no subtlety, yet neither had they left anything truly threatening. She moved quietly through the kitchen, pausing at each corner to check for disturbances. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, a comforting counterpoint to the tension building around her. Somewhere behind the closed blinds, a faint tapping echoed, like a hesitant knock against wood. Agatha tilted her head, listening. Perhaps a branch brushing the window, or perhaps not. Her mind flicked to the stranger, recalling his polite demeanor, his uncanny knowledge of the village, and the subtle inconsistencies she had noticed earlier. Part of her wanted to confront him, demand an explanation for the oddities she had observed. Another part urged patience, to watch and wait, gathering information as she always did. Agatha paced slowly toward the sitting room, weighing the decision. The room's cozy warmth, the familiar scent of tea and baked scones lingering from earlier, contrasted sharply with the prickling awareness that something unseen had left traces of its presence. She approached the window, pulling the curtains just slightly aside. The garden was quiet again, save for the swaying roses and the fading light painting patterns across the stone path. Yet even in stillness, the unease lingered, a gentle hum beneath the comfort of her home. Agatha imagined the stranger moving quietly, observing her routines, cataloguing each familiar detail with careful attention. It was as though the calm domesticity of her life had been momentarily overlaid with a subtle, almost playful tension. The kettle began to whistle softly, and she poured herself a small cup of tea, the warmth seeping into her hands and grounding her thoughts. She sipped slowly, letting the familiar flavor of bergamot and sugar calm the fluttering edges of suspicion. Even so, she could not ignore the sense of being watched, the small misalignments that hinted at a presence just beyond her notice. Agatha settled into her armchair, knitting basket at her side, and let her mind wander through possibilities. Was it merely coincidence, or was someone testing her awareness? The evening shadows stretched longer, and with them the delicate tension of anticipation. No overt danger had arrived, yet the sense of a hidden observer was tangible, a thread pulling at her curiosity. As night deepened and the garden faded into muted shapes, Agatha closed her eyes briefly, savouring the quiet of her cottage while remaining alert. The unease lingered, gentle but insistent, a promise that the evening held more than the ordinary, somewhere out there in the gathering darkness. The first hints of revelation waited, and she, as always, would notice. The following morning the garden was drenched in soft sunlight, dew glinting on every leaf like scattered gem. Agatha wandered among her rose beds, her fingers brushing lightly against the velvety petals. She had intended a simple morning of tending her plants, yet her attention was drawn to an unusual sight, a folded handkerchief. Neatly placed atop the low stone wall bordering the lavender patch, Agatha paused, frowning. The fabric was fine, unfamiliar, and bore an intricate monogram embroidered in thread slightly faded with age. Her mind raced as she turned it over in her hands, noting the faint scent of pipe smoke lingering in its fibres. The handkerchief was not hers, nor did it belong to anyone in the village she could immediately recall. It was deliberate, left for her to find. Setting it gently aside on a nearby bench, she studied it with careful consideration. The craftsmanship hinted at a person who valued appearances, detail, and propriety. Someone who had lived in places where manners and presentation were paramount. She could almost imagine the stranger, neat, careful, precise, folding it before stepping out of her garden. It was a trace of him, small and silent, yet profoundly telling. Agatha's thoughts drifted to the inconsistencies she had observed during their conversations. The minor contradictions, the precise observations of village life, the subtle misremembering of her neighbour's habits. All of it began to form a delicate portrait. Whoever he was, he had a background layered with experience, perhaps even a measure of refinement, and yet something about him remained deliberately hidden. She walked slowly through the garden, her eyes catching details she might otherwise have overlooked. A faint footprint in the soft soil near the lavender suggested someone had lingered longer than a casual visitor would. The pot she had straightened yesterday now appeared to have been nudged again, and the corner of the hedges showed subtle signs of disturbance, as if someone had paused to observe her routines. Each clue was minor, yet together they created a pattern she could not ignore. Agatha settled onto the stone bench, the handkerchief folded neatly in her lap, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She imagined the stranger's life beyond Carsely, the streets he had walked, the places he had visited, and the people whose habits he had catalogued. There was a certain elegance to the way he carried himself, but also an air of caution, a careful masking of intention. The hints of a hidden past teased at stories untold. Adventures and perhaps missteps kept carefully behind a polite smile. The garden remained quiet, save for the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze and the distant crow of a rooster. Agatha inhaled deeply, the familiar sense grounding her while her mind traced possibilities. Who was he really? What had brought him here? And why leave a personal trace so carefully positioned, as though daring her to notice? With a soft sigh, she placed the handkerchief back on the bench, arranging it as neatly as possible. It was a small token, a whisper of a story not yet told, but it had already deepened the intrigue. Agatha's eyes swept over her garden once more, alert, amused and keenly aware that the stranger's past, like the shadows of the hedges, was quietly entwined with her present, and that unravelling it would require patience, attention and perhaps a touch of cleverness. Chapter 5. Clues and Contradictions. Agatha moved through the village with quiet determination, her basket swinging lightly at her side as she observed familiar faces and took careful note of their behaviours. The sun had climbed higher, spilling warmth over the cobblestones, but her attention remained sharp, focused on subtle cues that might reveal more about the stranger's movements. Every gesture, every glance, and every snippet of conversation was a potential clue to be catalogued and analysed. She paused near the fountain where Mrs. Maple was fussing over her window display. "Morning, Miss Raisin," she said, glancing at Agatha with a slight frown. "Did you notice the man yesterday? Odd fellow, isn't he? Asking about the vicar, the baker, and even the postman. Seemed quite interested in everyone's habits." Agatha nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Indeed," she replied. "I noticed he had a keen eye for details." She tucked the observation away in her mind, weighing it against what she had already gathered. A few steps later, she encountered Mr. Pritchard, who was delivering letters with his usual haste. He waved cheerfully. "Miss Raisin!" "You'll never believe it. Someone saw the stranger near the old manor last evening." "Curious, isn't it?" Curious indeed, Agatha thought, but she kept her tone light. "Interesting." "And did he appear to notice anything peculiar while he was there?" Mr. Pritchard shrugged. "Hard to say. Some say he looked quite absorbed, others claim he lingered by the gate like he was waiting for someone. Conflicting reports, you understand?" Agatha's eyebrows lifted, amusement flickering across her face. Conflicting reports were hardly unusual in Carsely, yet this one seemed particularly tantalizing. She made a mental note to cross-reference with other villagers' accounts, aware that small inconsistencies often revealed more than consistent stories ever could. By midday, she had visited the bakery, the post office, and even the cobbler's shop, quietly observing reactions to the stranger's presence. Some villagers described him as polite, attentive, and even charming. Others insisted he was peculiar, overly meticulous, and almost theatrical in manner. Agatha catalogued each statement with the precision of a detective, noting minor contradictions that hinted at something more complex beneath the surface. She found herself pausing at intervals, letting the rhythm of village life carry her forward. Children chased each other near the fountain, the scent of freshly baked bread drifted through the square, and a cat darted between flower pots. The ordinary comforts of Carsely contrasted sharply with the delicate tension that had begun to weave through her morning. Even in the midst of the village's gentle chaos, the stranger's presence lingered, like a quiet shadow moving just out of reach. Agatha allowed herself a small, private chuckle, amused by the intricate puzzle forming before her. Each observation, each conflicting report, was another piece to fit into the larger picture, a picture that was slowly revealing a stranger more nuanced, careful, and intriguing than she had first assumed. By the time she returned home, the sun had softened, casting golden light over the garden. Agatha placed her basket down, eyes scanning the familiar path with renewed attentiveness. Puzzle pieces, she mused, were often deceptively simple on their own, but when combined they hinted at something altogether more compelling, and she, naturally, intended to assemble them with meticulous care. Agatha returned to her cottage just as the sun began to dip behind the rolling hills, casting long, dappled shadows across the garden. She had spent the afternoon gathering observations and listening discreetly to the villagers, piecing together snippets of conversation, yet one remark in particular refused to leave her mind. Something Mrs. Dunning had muttered near the bakery, a comment brushed off in casual talk, resonated with an unsettling clarity. She placed her basket on the counter and brewed herself a cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands as her mind replayed the details. The stranger, she realized, had been near the old manor the evening of a minor but curious incident. A gate left unlocked, a window slightly ajar, and, most intriguingly, the sudden disappearance of a small, valuable trinket from the manor's parlour. Nothing accusatory had been said aloud, yet the coincidence felt deliberate, or at least carefully concealed. Agatha perched on the edge of her chair, balancing the cup in one hand, and let the notion settle. The stranger's presence was no longer merely peculiar. It carried implications she could not ignore. Her mind raced through possibilities. He could be harmlessly curious, or he could have taken advantage of a moment of inattention. Or perhaps, she considered with a twitch of a smile, he was testing her, gauging whether she noticed, whether she could follow the delicate threads he left behind. She replayed his polite demeanor in her mind, the carefully measured words, the tiny inconsistencies in his accounts. Now they seemed less charmingly curious and more pointed. Every compliment about her garden, every observation of village habits, every fleeting smile could have been a distraction while he collected information. The revelation, while subtle, shifted her perspective. The visitor was no ordinary wanderer, nor a simple eccentric. There was method behind the manners, a quiet precision that demanded attention. And yet, Agatha could not suppress a faint, private amusement. There was something almost theatrical in the way he moved through her village, polite and attentive, leaving breadcrumbs for her to follow. She sipped her tea, letting the taste of bergamot settle her thoughts, even as curiosity flared anew. The contradiction of feeling both intrigue and mild. Exasperation created a peculiar tension she relished, a blend of puzzle and performance that seemed uniquely suited to Carsely. She glanced toward the garden gate, half expecting to see the stranger's shadow lurking among the hedges, but the path remained empty and quiet. Still, the knowledge of his subtle involvement in the recent incident cast a new light on every interaction she had shared with him. There was playfulness, certainly, but also intention, and that sharpened her focus. Agatha set the cup down, fingers tapping lightly against the table as she considered her next steps. Observation alone would not suffice. She needed to engage, to probe, to test the boundaries of his polite facade. Yet she also recognized the value of patience, of letting him reveal his motives in his own time. The afternoon's revelation had added both weight and intrigue to the visitor's presence, transforming a harmless curiosity into a quietly compelling mystery. Leaning back, Agatha allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The game had shifted subtly, the stage was set, and she, ever vigilant, ever amused, was ready to watch as the next act unfolded. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Confessions. Agatha set her teacup down with deliberate precision, letting the faint clink echo across the kitchen. The kettle had cooled, the room bathed in the soft amber glow of late afternoon, yet the air seemed charged with anticipation. She rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her apron, and turned toward the stranger, who remained seated with a calm composure that both amused and unsettled her. "Mr. Langley?" she began, her voice even, polite, but carrying the weight of quiet scrutiny. "It seems you have taken quite an interest in Carsely." He inclined his head slightly, lips curving into a faint, controlled smile. "Interest is hardly a crime, Miss Raisin. I simply find the village fascinating. Observing its rhythms, its people, it is a small, delightful stage for subtle truth." Agatha raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "Delightful, perhaps, but your observations appear more precise than casual curiosity warrants." "I cannot help but notice certain discrepancies in your accounts. Little details that don't quite align." He sipped his tea without haste, eyes flicking toward the window, as though the garden might reveal its secrets. Discrepancies, you say? I assure you, I speak only from memory and polite conversation. Memory, as you know, is a curious thing, sometimes selective, sometimes interpretive. Agatha tilted her head, resisting the urge to smile at the familiar deflection. Interpretive, indeed. You spoke yesterday of wandering through the village without intention, yet today you recall specifics, trivial yet precise, about certain villagers' habits. Curious how memory shifts when convenient. He leaned back, fingers brushing lightly against the teacup handle. I may have allowed my mind to linger on certain details longer than others. I confess I am observant. Some might say too observant, though I hope not intrusive. A small chuckle escaped Agatha, her amusement threading through the tension. Observant, yes. Intrusive, perhaps. One wonders why exactly you lingered near the manor the other evening, or why certain items in my garden seemed repositioned. His eyes met hers, a glimmer of honesty, or calculated honesty, surfacing in the depths of his calm gaze. Ah, those were inadvertent. Or perhaps a gentle test of your awareness, Miss Raisin. It is not impolite to see if one's host notices small nuances, is it? Agatha allowed the statement to hang, letting the warmth of the kitchen contrast with the sharpness of her thoughts. She studied his posture, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the slight lift of an eyebrow. He was careful, disciplined, and undeniably clever, yet beneath the politeness, she detected the faintest tremor of something unspoken. You are evasive, she observed, lightly, though her eyes shone with curiosity rather than reproach. Polite, yes, but evasive. One wonders whether you enjoy the game of shadows more than the truth itself. A quiet smile curved his lips. Perhaps, or perhaps I simply enjoy discovering minds as keen as my own. Your awareness is refreshing. Agatha leaned back, letting the conversation settle in the warmth of her kitchen. Tea sat between them, steam curling upward, comforting and grounding. The dialogue had revealed fragments of truth, glimpses of hidden intent, yet much remained unspoken, a delicate web of manners, observation and mystery. She picked up her teacup again, sipping deliberately, eyes fixed on him with quiet amusement. The room remained calm, cozy and inviting, yet beneath the domestic comfort pulsed the subtle thrill of intrigue. She could not name his exact motives nor predict his next move, but the stage was set, the tension poised, and she was determined to notice every gesture, every nuance, every carefully placed word. In Carsely, even polite tea could conceal secrets, and in this quiet kitchen, Agatha Raisin intended to uncover them all. Agatha rested her chin on her hand, eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the situation. The stranger sat across from her, composed, polite, yet undeniably observant, as if reading not just her words, but her thoughts. She allowed a quiet chuckle to escape. Perhaps, she mused, the time had come to shift tactics. Direct confrontation yielded fragments of truth, but a cooperative approach might reveal far more. You know, Mr. Langley, she began, her voice lightly teasing. One might argue that two heads are better than one when it comes to unraveling mysteries. He raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a faint, amused smile. Are you suggesting an alliance, Miss Raisin? That we join forces despite previous uncertainties? Temporary, of course, she replied, letting the words hang in the warm afternoon air. I have no desire to cede control of my village, nor to share my garden tea entirely. But perhaps we could observe, exchange what we notice, and see where it leads. For curiosity's sake, and nothing else. He inclined his head, slowly considering. Curiosity is a worthy motive, he said at last, and I confess your perceptiveness intrigues me. Cooperation might indeed be advantageous, though I warn you I do not yield easily, nor do I share lightly. Agatha smiled inwardly, noting the faint tension in his posture, the subtle precision in his gestures. He was clever, no doubt, yet the notion of combining wits, albeit warily, offered her the potential to glean far more than observation alone could provide. Excellent, she said, tapping her fingers lightly against the table. Then we have an understanding, mutual observation, occasional exchange, relevant details, and, of course, discretion. It seems only fair that each of us retains our boundaries. Boundaries acknowledged, he replied, his tone courteous yet carrying a quiet challenge. I am curious to see how our alliance will unfold. Carsely is a village of small movements and large stories after all. Observation may yield surprises we did not anticipate. Agatha allowed herself a subtle laugh, imagining the contrast of their personalities, her directness tempered by his carefully calculated politeness. The idea of walking the village side by side, both scrutinizing and assessing, promised both amusement and insight. There was a delicate thrill in the arrangement, a playful tension that made her pulse quicken, just enough to be enjoyable without discomfort. She poured herself another cup of tea, the aroma of bergamot and sugar mingling with the faint scent of the afternoon garden drifting through the open window. The kettle's warmth, the cozy domesticity, and the carefully measured conversation created a comforting backdrop for what was essentially a game of strategy. Agatha leaned back in her chair, fingers tracing the rim of the cup. Their alliance was temporary, tentative, and tinged with subtle suspicion, exactly as it should be. She allowed herself a quiet smile, sensing that the arrangement, delicate though it was, might offer glimpses of truth she had not yet imagined. Very well. Mr. Langley, she said softly, her eyes twinkling. Let us see what secrets Carsely holds and who notices them first. The stranger inclined his head, a faint, polite smile hinting at unspoken amusement. And in that small, cozy kitchen, amid the steam of tea and the lingering scent of roses, the uneasy partnership was quietly forged, one of mutual curiosity, tentative trust, and playful, suspenseful anticipation. Chapter 7. Secrets Unfold. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sun spilling across Carsley's cobblestone streets and painting the cottages in a soft golden light. Agatha wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, basket in hand, eyes alert to every movement. The village felt ordinary, serene, yet beneath the calm she sensed threads of long-hidden stories beginning to stir. Her first stop was the manor, where a few early risers had gathered near the fountain. Whispered conversations drifted on the air, small remarks carrying more than their apparent significance. Agatha approached cautiously, allowing her keen observation to catalogue each gesture, glance, and comment. It was in these quiet details that the stranger's motives might finally reveal themselves. Miss Raisin, called Mrs. Maple, fluttering her apron as she rearranged flowers along the window ledge. I hope you've heard. Some say that visitor has connections stretching further than any of us imagined. Strange, isn't it? Agatha nodded, pretending casual interest, yet inwardly her mind raced. Connections stretching beyond the village hinted at a more layered past, an intersection of lives, secrets, and histories carefully concealed. She observed the subtle shift in the villagers' expressions, curiosity mixed with apprehension, amusement tinged with uncertainty. Each reaction was a small clue, a reflection of something larger yet unseen. By midday, Agatha had retraced the stranger's recent movements, noting the precise paths he had taken and the places where he had lingered. A garden gate left slightly ajar, a shop window rearranged, a fleeting shadow along the cobblestone alley. These details were no longer random. Patterns emerged, and with them a story of careful attention, deliberate observation, and a quiet, almost theatrical interest in Carsley's daily life. Her thoughts turned to the manor's past scandal, a matter long whispered but never fully addressed. The disappearance of a small family heirloom, the sudden absence of a long-forgotten visitor, and the hushed hints of a betrayal, it all began to coalesce in Agatha's mind. And the stranger, with his polite questions, his subtle contradictions, and his carefully monitored movements, seemed to intersect neatly with these unresolved threads. She found herself smiling at the elegance of it all. There was danger, certainly, though of a measured sort. Curiosity, yes, but never outright threat. And amusement, layered gently atop the tension. Agatha noted how the stranger's demeanor shifted subtly whenever a particular topic arose, his measured smile, a brief hesitation, a tilt of the head. These small reactions, when observed carefully, revealed more than words ever could. By late afternoon, she returned to her garden, basket lighter, thoughts heavier. The handkerchief from earlier lay where she had placed it, a tangible reminder of the visitor's presence and precision. She considered his motives, weighing the evidence and piecing together the connections between past events and present actions. Carsley's quiet charm, she realized, was a perfect foil for subtle intrigue, the ordinary masking the extraordinary, the gentle rhythms of village life providing cover for secrets long hidden. Agatha sat on her stone bench, eyes sweeping the familiar landscape with renewed attention. The stranger's past was no longer an abstract notion, but a series of tangible hints, threads she could trace with patience, wit, and careful observation. Each revelation, small though it might be, brought clarity, yet left enough mystery to sustain curiosity as the sun dipped low, casting a warm, golden glow across the garden. Agatha allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The pieces were beginning to fit together, the hidden motives of the visitor slowly emerging from the shadows. And she, as always, was determined to follow the trail to its end, savoring every subtle clue, every hint of intrigue, every delicate step toward understanding the stranger who had so quietly entered her world. Agatha settled into her favorite chair by the window, the late afternoon sunlight casting a warm glow across the cushions. The garden beyond shimmered with gold and green, the roses bending gently in the breeze, yet her mind was far from tranquil. Today had been one of quiet observation, careful deduction, and the slow, satisfying piecing together of scattered clues. At last, the outline of the stranger's motives had begun to take shape. She thought back to the handkerchief left in her garden, the small misplacements, the fleeting shadows, and the whispered comments from villagers. Each detail, small and seemingly insignificant on its own, now wove together into a delicate tapestry of intention. The stranger's interest had not been idle curiosity. It had been measured, deliberate, a study of the village and its people, especially her. He had moved among them with care, observing routines, cataloguing habits, and leaving hints designed for her to notice. Agatha allowed herself a soft smile. He was clever, certainly, but not without a touch of playfulness. The motives she had inferred were not malicious, merely curious, perhaps tinged with the faintest desire for amusement and understanding. Carsely, with its quiet charm and predictable rhythms, had become his stage, and she, the ever-watchful observer, had caught the threads he laid down. She leaned forward, fingers tapping lightly on the wooden armrest, recalling the peculiar interactions of the past days, the polite deflections, the tiny contradictions in his stories, the deliberate attention to detail. All of it had been a test, and she had played along, attentive yet amused. The realization brought a gentle sense of satisfaction, a quiet triumph wrapped in the familiar comforts of her home. Even so, not every question had been answered. A faint wrinkle of mystery remained in his polite smile, a subtle hint that more layers existed beyond her current understanding. Agatha appreciated the balance, a resolution that offered clarity and insight, yet left enough space for curiosity to linger. She sipped her tea, letting the taste of bergamot and warmth of the cup ground her in the moment, a cozy counterpoint to the mental work she had just completed. The village outside continued its gentle rhythms. A cart rolled lazily down the main street, Mrs. Maple waved to a passing neighbour, and the scent of baking bread wafted through the open window. Agatha's mind traced the connections one last time, confirming her deductions while allowing herself a touch of private amusement. The stranger's motives were clever, subtle, and entirely consistent with the playful tension he had introduced into her otherwise orderly life. As evening shadows stretched across the garden, Agatha set her teacup aside and let a contented sigh escape. The puzzle had been completed, threads aligned, motives understood. Yet the quiet thrill of curiosity remained, like a gentle hum beneath the familiar calm. Carsely was as cozy and inviting as ever, and she, its vigilant yet amused observer, felt both satisfaction and anticipation for the stories that might still unfold. She leaned back, eyes drifting to the fading sunlight and the neatly arranged roses, smiling softly. Even when puzzles were solved, life, like her village, retained a touch of mystery, just enough to keep every day engaging, every conversation worth noting, and every visitor worth watching. Chapter 8. Farewell and Reflection. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked earth and distant fields in bloom. Agatha moved through her garden with deliberate ease, brushing her hands over the soft petals of roses and the familiar leaves of lavender. Today was different, though the village remained unchanged in its gentle rhythms. The stranger, Mr. Langley, had made his intentions clear. He would be leaving Carsely by midday. She arranged a small tray with leftover scones and a pot of tea, just as she had on the days when polite conversation had doubled as subtle investigation. The room glowed in the soft morning light, and yet an unusual stillness lingered, as if the house itself sensed the approaching departure. Agatha poured a cup, the steam curling upward, and placed it near the window where she could watch the garden path. When he arrived at the gate, a figure calm and precise as ever, she noted the faint crease in his coat, the slight tilt of his hat, and the glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Their eyes met, and for a moment the usual playful tension of their interactions filled the air. He gave a slight bow of acknowledgement. "Miss Raisin," he began, voice smooth, measured, "I hope my visit has caused no undue disturbance. Your village is, as I suspected, as delightful as it appears, and you, more perceptive than I could have anticipated." Agatha inclined her head, a small smile forming. "Mr. Langley, I would say the same. Your presence was, if nothing else, an education in observation and subtlety." They lingered near the gate, speaking quietly, their words courteous but layered with meaning. Each sentence carried hints of past discoveries, a shared understanding of the delicate game they had played over the previous days. There was satisfaction in their exchange, a mutual recognition of wit and intelligence, tempered by polite distance. As he adjusted his coat and stepped toward the path leading from the village, Agatha felt a faint tug of both relief and curiosity. The tension that had gently underpinned every interaction now gave way to a sense of closure. Yet, like the shadows lingering beneath the hedges and along the garden path, small mysteries remained, whispers of what he had observed, hints of motives only partially disclosed, and the subtle reminder that some puzzles never fully resolve. She watched him walk away, the rhythm of his steps confident, measured, almost theatrical in its precision. Carsely seemed unchanged, the villagers moving through their routines, unaware of the quiet examinations and clever deductions that had passed among them. Agatha allowed herself a deep breath, savouring the peace of the garden, the warmth of her home, and the lingering thrill of curiosity satisfied. For now, returning to the bench beneath the rose arbour, she settled herself with a cup of tea, letting her thoughts drift. The experience had reinforced her appreciation for human nature, the subtle games people play, the concealed intentions, and the gentle revelations that emerge when one watches carefully. She smiled at the memory of his polite evasions, the slight contradictions, and the eventual cooperation that had brought clarity to their quiet interplay. Even as the village basked in the soft afternoon sun, Agatha sensed that life would continue to hum along its familiar lines, yet beneath the ordinary, traces of intrigue would persist, tiny mysteries tucked in shadows, playful observations, and the occasional unexpected visitor. With a quiet sigh, she sipped her tea, allowing the warmth to settle, the garden to shimmer, and the satisfaction of closure to mix with the gentle promise of curiosity yet to come. In Carsely, the ordinary and the mysterious coexisted, and Agatha Raisin, always attentive, always amused, was ready to notice it all. Sunlight streamed softly through the lace curtains, spilling a warm glow across Agatha's kitchen. The aroma of freshly brewed tea mingled with the faint scent of dew drifting in from the open window. Birds chirped in the garden, their song a familiar, comforting backdrop to the quiet hum of village life. Agatha stretched, letting the calm of the morning settle into her bones. Yet a faint spark of curiosity lingered, nudging her mind awake. She moved through her routine with practiced ease, collecting eggs from the hen house, arranging the roses, and straightening the small table where she enjoyed her breakfast. Even ordinary motions felt infused with a new, subtle awareness, her eyes flicking toward paths, hedges, and corners where small disturbances might hint at hidden stories. The memory of the stranger's visit had left her more alert, more attuned to the rhythms of Carsely, and she welcomed the gentle shift. As she poured her tea and set a plate of scones on the table, she allowed herself a quiet smile. The garden shimmered with morning dew, ordinary yet alive, and the village beyond her gate hummed along its predictable lines. A neighbour's cart rattled over the cobbles, and children's laughter echoed from the square. Everything seemed familiar, safe and comforting, yet her mind danced lightly with the possibilities of what might quietly unfold. Small mysteries, subtle oddities, perhaps another visitor whose motives would require careful observation. Agatha's gaze drifted toward the far corner of the garden where a single violet had sprouted unexpectedly among the lavender. She knelt to examine it, brushing her fingers gently across its delicate petals. "Curiosity never truly rests," she murmured to herself, a faint chuckle escaping. Even in a place as cozy and seemingly predictable as Carsely, life retained small surprises, whispers of intrigue tucked beneath the ordinary. Finishing her tea, she carried her plate outside to the bench beneath the rose arbor, the garden alive with the morning's gentle activity. The sun painted soft shadows across the cobblestones, and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted from a neighbor's window. Agatha allowed herself to simply observe, savoring the peace while remaining alert to the smallest hint of anomaly. It was a quiet balance, comfort and attentiveness, routine and possibility, that she had come to relish. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faintest hint of movement near the hedges. Agatha's eyes twinkled, not with alarm, but with anticipation. Perhaps it was nothing more than a bird or a stray cat, yet the mind of a detective, however gentle, cannot help but notice. The cycle of village life, its charms and secrets continued, and she, ever watchful, ever amused, was ready to notice, to deduce, and to enjoy, settling back on the bench with her tea. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the warmth seep into her hands. Carsely's quiet streets, the shimmer of the garden, and the lingering sense of curiosity combined to create a perfect morning. And as the sun climbed higher, Agatha Raisin smiled, confident that while one story had concluded, the gentle mysteries of the village would always provide new threads to follow, always a reason to stay alert, amused, and deeply satisfied with the cozy world she called home.